Welcome back to You Can't Say That in Court, a podcast by Rise Women's Legal Center. I'm Vicky Law.
And I'm Stephanie Melnick. We are your hosts as we continue this conversation about survivors of violence navigating the BC family law system. We recognize that the legal system we have in BC is colonial and causes harm to families, which disproportionately impacts Indigenous people.
By speaking openly about these harms, we hope to raise awareness about the challenges survivors face as they navigate the colonial family law system. Our podcast is an attempt to collectively identify the barriers and advocate for positive changes to be made. Thank you for joining. Our podcast series will discuss difficult topics such as gender-based violence and intimate partner violence. This includes physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, and financial abuse. Please be aware that this is a thread that is woven throughout all the episodes, and we hope you will take care of yourselves however you need.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 9 of You Can't Say That in Court. We are going to be talking about decolonizing family law for the next couple of episodes. This is a topic we've wanted to address for quite a while because we think there are a lot of benefits, and getting this out into the wider kind of audience across BC would be really beneficial. So we haven't really done up until now an in-depth introduction. Looking at our ancestry, but we thought in the context of decolonizing family law, it makes a lot of sense. So I just wanted to say that I'm a first generation settler of Ukrainian descent through my father and English and Scottish through my mother. And I'm super grateful to be in so-called Canada because my father's family could not go back to Ukraine after World War II. And they came to Montreal instead, and I'm so glad they did. My mother was raised in California, but also made her way back to Canada once she was an adult. And yeah, we've all been in the country ever since.
Thanks, Steph. And I'm a first generation settler. I was born in Hong Kong, and my family immigrated to Canada when I was a young child. As with many of the Hong Kong residents, my family was concerned about the British handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997, though this was not the only reason why they immigrated. I had extended family here on so-called Canada for a while, and my grandparents were really hoping that my family would come and join them. And throughout my life so far, I've lived in various places in this country, and I'm very lucky and grateful to spend the majority of my life on Turtle Island.
Yeah, I feel like this would have been a nice way to maybe start our podcast way back when. I do appreciate when people are introducing themselves with a bit more context and some gratitude. It does kind of ground us all and shows where we have similarities. So it's a nice way to start off talking about decolonizing family law. We're going to be relying quite heavily on both a report written by our colleague Haley Rymack and her co-author Myrna McCallum, and also the expertise of Myrna McCallum, who is a Métis lawyer, a trauma educator, and a super dynamic and engaging speaker. We've listened to a number of her podcast episodes. Myrna's podcast is called The Trauma Informed Lawyer, and it's really great for anyone who works with people. So although our context on You Can't Say That in Court is a lot about lawyers and support workers, family law advocates, and other legal professionals, others that can benefit are educators and social workers, people in healthcare, first responders, again, pretty much anyone who works with people. So we'll put that link in the notes as well. So if anyone wants to check out Myrna's podcast, it's really great. Shall we get into some of the concepts to start, Vicky?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we wanted to start right at the beginning with what does decolonizing mean? And I think the best place to start is just to recognize that colonial practices in and of themselves really exist to oppress. And so when we're trying to decolonize, we're looking to center and uphold the rights of Indigenous people. The really beautiful side effect of this is that it benefits all people when we look at Indigenous people as whole and as having been and continue to be oppressed by a lot of the systems in Canada. Yeah, it's really important, I think, for all of us to recognize that. Um, yeah, and that there was just a legal system basically that was imposed on Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And here we're talking about just the legal system, but I think it's also important to recognize like everything that we're doing right now as how our society exists, like the healthcare system, the financial
Right.
system, like those
Yeah.
are all very colonial and have been imposed on these lands and Indigenous people. So while we're referring to the legal system, because that's what we know, I also
Yeah.
want to acknowledge that there's all these other forms that us as members of the community and society rely on that are not Indigenous led.
Right. And if anyone struggles to kind of connect to this idea of systems of oppression, I think almost everyone has experienced something like you're saying in the wider array of systems, whether it's financial, education, legal, whatever it might be. Someone has experienced something unfair at some point. And I think that's a really good entry point to understanding that oppressive nature and the reason why a lot of laws were developed in the first place on purpose to uphold those who had power and to maintain that power and to push down and kind of disempower those that they were trying to control. So it's a
Mm-hmm.
big concept, but there are entry points. There are places where we can all connect to that idea. And cultural humility is kind of one of those first pieces that we can think about, and just in a really simple way, respecting different views, and being open to learn, like being open to understand and trying not to jump to conclusions is a really good way to connect with that idea, especially being an uninvited settler. It's really on us
Mm-hmm.
to be open-minded and to listen and learn. Yeah, to try not to have too many preconceived notions.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest pillars of this is like staying curious and being curious to learn as opposed to
Yeah,
being curious to ask questions with finding a result or a
right,
resolution or coming to s- verifying some kind of preconceived notion of how things
right.
are.
Right. Yes. Yeah. The needing to find a solution right away is a very colonial um, value, and it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't serve many of us. You know, having space to just listen and, like you say, not even ask questions, just create space to sit and listen.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if we want to actively ask questions, absolutely, but just having the space to learn can be really, really helpful in finding a better solution. So there are a lot of benefits to trying to stay open. It's hard. We're trained every day, and all of our systems teach us to just be productive and move to the conclusion and move on to the next task, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I just want to clarify, I don't think we're saying don't ask questions. It's
No,
more
okay,
like
yeah,
if you're going to ask questions, think about why you're asking it. Are you asking it
right.
to be curious and learn more from the person who's offering that information? Or are
Hmm.
you asking those questions to support what you have in the back of your mind as the proposed
Right.
answer?
Right. That's a really good distinction because, yeah, we hear a lot about when we're trying to stay curious, not formulating the next statement or something in
Mm-hmm.
that moment and just being and listening is really important. So sometimes it's better to not say anything. But yes, the motivation for asking the question, I agree, is really important. It takes a lot of it kind of is why we're talking about cultural humility. It takes a lot of humility to just be honest with ourselves about why we're
Mm-hmm.
asking things and why we're saying certain statements. A lot of it is to seem smart, to be perfect to have the answer. I know that's something I've struggled with for sure. And a really helpful kind of saying is perfection is the enemy of good enough. I really found
Hmm.
that super helpful because I would often get paralyzed in trying to move forward, have the right answer, get stuff done super fast, whatever it was, to demonstrate that yes, I've got this nailed down. But sometimes making mistakes and not having the right answer all the time is really important, and being yeah, honest with ourselves enough to be able to apologize for that and learn from our mistakes, I think is the best way forward. Because I hope we all want to move forward. The idea is that we're trying to move forward, right? And if we're trying to be perfect about it, it's not going to move as quickly as we need it to.
Yeah, I think one of the important parts here is acknowledging that we all have made mistakes in the
Yeah.
past. And it's not to fault on who is making the mistake or what has caused um the consequences from that mistake, I suppose. But it's
Hmm.
learning from it and talking about it and being open and being like, okay, if this were to happen again, how can we do it differently?
And if we have caused harm in those blunders, in
Mhm.
those moments of not knowing any better, then there are things we can do to make amends. Recognizing that the things we say, how we do things can cause harm, but there's always a way to try and make amends and at least acknowledge that. And that's a really great learning process as well, because it
Hmm.
opens up that opportunity to learn from the person that might have been harmed.
Yeah.
Yeah. We had a note here about the term Indigenous. We wanted to just kind of make a statement about that the term Indigenous currently is meant to represent First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, but that the term does fall short because Indigenous people and cultures have so much diversity, and the term doesn't really reflect all of that. So we are continuing to use the word Indigenous, but staying open to, yeah, the chance to talk about more of the nuance and the diversity in cultures.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about diversity, we often think of it in a concept of like different groups of people. But I
Hmm.
think diversity also encompasses the different times, right? So, for
Hmm.
example, my Chinese culture is different in the current time as it was in my
Mm,
grandparents' time, right? So culture
right.
is not
Yes.
static. It doesn't stay the same throughout a given time period. And we also have to recognize that form of diversity.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Indigenous people's ways of living uh, won't be the same today as they were 100
Hmm.
years ago, even under colonial law. Yeah, so there's a lot of change, hopefully mostly for the better. And even how people perceive the challenges that they're facing right now. So there are lots of people, even in the legal system, who have talked about we just need to start over. We need to dismantle
Mm.
all of these colonial harms and we need to kind of tear it down and start all over again. And then there are others who feel like making stepwise changes within the system we have is a smarter way forward. As we learn more and understand more, then we can make adjustments. And no one way is the right way. But we are definitely, working with Rise. We're in an organization that is working and complying on, generally within the current legal system, and we're working very hard to change it in a stepwise fashion with, the things that we learn on a daily basis. So, yeah, we also recognize that there are different ways of doing justice, and
Hmm.
we kind of shy away a bit from the term justice. We've used legal system quite a bit. I think I used justice system in the last episode, and as soon as I said it, I was like, that's not a term I agree with necessarily. But it is. Justice is still a concept. It is still a thing, and it might not look the way we think it should in all cases. But when we do see it, it feels really good. So just recognizing in the context of decolonization that colonial laws are very individualized and they're also very specific to certain incidents. You know, there's not a big sweeping long-term context that we take in the legal system, as we've talked about in just the very definition of coercive and controlling behavior, for example, coercive behavior requires a long-term view of a pattern over time. And
Hmm.
so colonial laws aren't really set up initially to think of it that way, but when we look at Indigenous practices and Indigenous legal systems and approaches, they are more generally relational and much larger contexts. So yeah, just thinking about justice looking different for different people is a good way to practice cultural humility because we can open up to the idea that it's not the same for everyone. It's not uniform. And it probably wouldn't be the same within even a group of people, or like you're saying, Vicky, over time. It
Hmm.
changes over time also.
Yeah, I think the legal system strives to be just and strives to provide justice for sure.
Yeah, yeah,
But I just don't know that everyone would agree that the legal system is just, especially when we look at the levels of oppression and unfairness that the system treats certain people.
right. Well, and we've both spoken with lots of people and worked with lots of people within the justice system.
Mm,
And people who are upholding the processes are often surprised and frustrated with the outcomes.
yeah.
It's not universal that people who are maintaining the processes are like, well, whatever, whatever happens, happens. It's meant to be that way. They're like, that is not the way that should have gone. And why did it go that way? And questioning, is the process contributing to unfair outcomes or whatever it might be in all of the different kind of legal areas. It's a good questioning to have, and I think that is part of decolonizing the whole system. Is everyone who works within it, everyone who works outside of it, questioning whether we're taking the right approach, because a change in approach can hopefully lead to better outcomes that take into account some of the things that maybe the original oppressive laws had been trying to eradicate or keep pushed down. Yeah.
Hmm. And it can take a really long time. So it's not an overnight
Yes.
change for sure,
Yeah.
especially when we're working to change the system. We know that it does take a long time, and sometimes it's super frustrating to be like, why doesn't, like, kind of what you're saying, Steph, about like burning it
Yeah.
down and starting it
Yeah.
over.
Yeah.
Um, and the problem that I think is that for some people, unfortunately, it's not changing fast enough.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and yet this is what we have, and this is what we have to work with in order to
Hmm.
make change.
Yeah. And I
And
think,
acknowledging that piece.
right. Yeah. Acknowledging that it takes time, and that stepwise change means really small wins, but hopefully more and more of them as we progress.
Hmm.
But when we're in those moments of frustration or the people who just want to burn it to the ground, it does feel like a pointless exercise sometimes to work with a system that has deeply entrenched harms, that is built on the premise of oppression. It feels discouraging sometimes, I think, to feel like, okay, we're going to try and change this in a stepwise fashion, but the underpinnings of the whole system are flawed. Um, I still think we can work with it because I have hope for the people who work within the system also, that when they're recognizing harms that are done and want to make a difference, a lot of the efforts, for example, that the government is making, I think is very indicative of wanting to move towards a more just legal system. Um, yeah, uh, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Could just keep going on and on. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why it's important for Rise to not only just do the direct client services that we have, because we hear from a lot of people who use our services to be like, this is wrong and this is unfair. And they
Yeah.
feel very alone, like they are the one
Yeah.
person who's experiencing this. And I think for a lot of the people who are providing the services at Rise, they're like, I'm seeing this trend. I am seeing
Hmm.
this happen to a lot of people, and
Right.
it's not okay. And then we do our larger systemic work, like these research reports or our more systemic advocacy, and we can take those voices that we've been hearing, and saying, this is not just one person, but here are all
Right.
the people who are experiencing this, and this is the larger impact that it's having. And so I think it's important to remember that, um, yes, the one-on-one experiences are very difficult, and we're trying to find solutions, sometimes really small solutions to these large barriers. At the end of the day, um, this information can be shared to a larger space in a good
Right.
way. And we have heard participants in our research work saying, while this is hard and it was difficult to navigate, I'm very grateful to know that my experiences can be shared to make better change.
Yeah, a lot of people say that when they work with us and they do the hard emotional work, the
Mm,
labor of sharing their experiences with us. It really is for that connection to others to know that they're not alone, but also to hopefully contribute to change. And I mean, that is one of the framings of our research is that it's resistance against
hmm.
colonial laws, right? That individualization, the purposeful individualization in colonial laws to separate people and also make them feel like they're the only ones going through that or that they are completely at fault. Yeah, being able to connect people's experiences is a show of resistance against that.
Hmm.
And I think it's important to remember also that there were laws before this colonial system,
Yeah.
that Indigenous ways of resolving disputes and keeping fairness in place was a legal system. And yeah, it's not helpful to think that when Canada established a legal system, that it was just the first time that was in place. But in fact, it was replacing everything else, and it's not as neutral as it likes to think. The
Yeah.
system itself has bias baked into it.
Yeah, and that like, for example, our current legal system is our current custom of way of
Right.
doing things, but there were customs and practices that Indigenous people had to resolve
Hmm.
conflict,
Right.
um, prior to colonization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know from what we've learned, a lot of the differences are in that kind of individualization that previous ways of resolving concerns and disputes and harms allowed for social contact. It allowed for a bigger look at
Hmm.
that person's connections, the person who caused harm as well as the people who were harmed, how are they all connected within the community? Um, and there are some calls for that social context to be brought into our current legal system, but there are downsides
Yeah.
that we've seen to that somehow that gets weaponized, and hearing about an Indigenous person's challenges may turn into a reason for the courts to make harsher sentences or to deprive someone of their entitlements.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest calls that we have heard and seen is expanding the definition of what a family is. Like, when we're
Yeah,
bringing it back to the work that we do, um, like, who is a family under the Family Law Act and the Divorce Act? And currently, the legislation considers, uh, they called parenting arrangements. So people who
right.
have time and who get to make decisions about children are the parents, because it's in the title. Um, but also that may not be how families are working together, right? We've got
Right.
maybe cousins, aunties, uncles, grandparents who are
Hmm.
involved in raising children. And currently, our legislation doesn't recognize that, and
Right.
or who can be a guardian. Like if you're not a parent, you know, have to apply to be a guardian. So for example, a grandma may have to apply for a guardian, which is very, very different. Like I come from a multi-generational family. So I was raised by
Right.
my grandma for my first year, and then my auntie my following years. And it's
Right.
just like not, you know, if I didn't see them, it was very odd for me growing up. I saw them
Right.
on a regular basis, if not daily. So
Mm-hmm.
um if we're looking at the best interest of the child as well in that definition, and thinking of, well, who gets to decide what is in the best interest of the child right now in terms of legislation? Again,
Mm-hmm.
we're looking at like the parents, um, but my parents worked such long days that it was like my grandma and my auntie who were looking out for my best
Right.
interests.
Yeah. And taking the best interests of the child approach the way it currently sits in legislation is a very isolating and individualized analysis, as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to all of those connections that the child has and the whole community of people that are involved in that child's life. That's a much different way of analyzing what is in the best interest if we look at the interests of the whole community, because
Mm-hmm.
it's impossible to take a kid out of their social context and determine what is in their best interest. I think if and when that is done, and it's done very often, it's a very two-dimensional look at what is quote unquote good for the child. So it's a different way of looking at it, and I think it's one of the benefits of the decolonization practice.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the ways that we can start, is looking at how we define things and what the definition is of certain things, in the legal context at least, and seeing what fits and what doesn't fit.
Yeah.
And definitely in the scenario of what the definition of family members is, or the best interest of the child, there's specific factors listed out for the best interest of the child, and how can we include other factors that might not be listed in there.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, so I think that's where we should pause the conversation. We're going to continue in the next episode, yeah?
Yes, definitely. And I think our next episode will talk more about some of the practical tips, specifically for legal professionals, on how to do a more trauma-informed practice, and working the best way that we can to support clients.
Great. And we have links for both Haley and Myrna's report as well as Myrna's podcast included in the show notes. And we'll continue the conversation next time.
Yes, talk soon.
Everything that we have said today is not legal advice. If you or someone you know needs legal advice, please consult with a lawyer.
If you enjoy listening to this podcast, please consider making a donation to support the work of Rise Women's Legal Center. We are a registered charity that is dedicated to improving access to justice in BC.
We help women and gender diverse people navigate the family law system and advocate to transform and improve the legal system. You can learn more about our work and make a donation by visiting womenslegalcenter.ca/donate or through the link in the episode description. If you like our podcast, please share it with your networks, friends, and family. If you want to keep up to date with the latest episode drops, you can follow Rise on social media. We are at Rise Women's Legal on all platforms.